Introduction of How to Tell Stories to Children and Some Stories to Tell by Sara Bryant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How to Tell Stories to Children and Some Stories to Tell by Sara Bryant. George G. Harrap and Company Limited, 2 and 3 Portsmouth Street, Kingsway, W.C., 1918. Books for Storytellers uniform with this volume. How to Tell Stories to Children and Some Stories to Tell by Sara Bryant, 10th impression. Stories to Tell Children with 53 Stories to Tell by Sara Bryant, 7th impression. The Book of Stories for the Storyteller by Fanny Coe, 4th impression. Songs and Stories for the Little Ones by E. Gordon Brown, M.A., with melodies chosen and arranged by Eva Brown, new and enlarged edition. Character Training, a graded series of lessons in ethics largely through storytelling by E. L. Cabot and E. Isles, 3rd impression, 384 pages. Stories for the Story Hour, from January to December, by Ada M. Marzials, 2nd impression. Stories for the History Hour, from Augustus to Rolf, by Nanny Niemeyer, 2nd impression. Stories for the Bible Hour, by R. Brimley Johnson, B.A. Nature Stories to Tell to Children, by H. Waddington Sears. Miss Maud Lindsay's Popular Books. Mother Stories with 16-line illustrations. More Mother Stories with 20-line illustrations. The Riverside Press Limited, Edinburgh, Great Britain. To my mother, the first best storyteller, this little book is dedicated. Preface. The stories which are given in the following pages are for the most part those which I have found to be best liked by the children to whom I have told these and others. I have tried to reproduce the form in which I actually tell them, although that inevitably varies with every repetition, feeling that it would be of greater value to another storyteller than a more closely literary form. For the same reason, I have confined my statements of theory as to method to those which reflect my own experience. My rules were drawn from introspection and retrospection at the urging of others long after the instinctive method they exemplify had become habitual. These facts are the basis of my hope that the book may be of use to those who have much to do with children. It would be impossible in the space of any pardonable preface to name the teachers, mothers, and librarians who have given me hints and helps during the past few years of storytelling. But I cannot let these pages go to press without recording my especial indebtedness to the few persons without whose interested aid the little book would scarcely have come to be. They are Mrs. Elizabeth Young Rutan, at whose generous instance I first enlarged my own field of entertaining storytelling to include hers, of educational narrative, and from whom I had many valuable suggestions at that time. Miss Ella L. Sweeney, Assistant Superintendent of Schools, Providence, Rhode Island, to whom I owe exceptional opportunities for investigation and experiment. Mrs. Root, Children's Librarian of Providence Public Library, and Miss Alice M. Jordan, Boston Public Library Children's Room, to whom I am indebted for much gracious and efficient aid. My thanks are due also to Mr. David Nutt for permission to make use of 3 stories from English Fairy Tales by Mr. Joseph Jacobs and Raggylug from Wild Animals I Have Known by Mr. Ernest Thompson Seton, to Messrs. Frederick A. Stokes Company for Five Little White Heads by Walter Learned, and for Bird Thoughts to Messrs. Keegan, Paul, Trench, Trubner and Company Limited for The Burning of the Rice Fields from Gleanings in Buddha Fields by Mr. Lafcadio Hearn, to Messrs. H.R. Allenson Limited for 3 stories from The Golden Windows by Miss Laura E. Richard, and to Mr. Seamus McManus for Billy Beg and His Bull from In Chimney Corners. Sarah Cohn Bryant. Contents: Introduction, The Storyteller's Art, Recent Revival, The Difference Between Telling a Story and Reading it Aloud, Some Reasons Why the Former is More Effective. Chapter 1. The Purpose of Storytelling in School, Its Immediate Advantages to the Teacher, Its Ultimate Gifts to the Child. Chapter 2. Selection of Stories to Tell, The Qualities Children Like and Why, Qualities Necessary for Oral Delivery. Examples: The Three Bears, The Three Little Pigs, The Old Woman and Her Pig. Suggestions as to the type of story especially useful in the several primary grades. Selected list of familiar fairy tales. Chapter 3. Adaptation of Stories for Telling. How to make a long story short. How to fill out a short story. General changes commonly desirable. Examples: The Nuremberg Stove by Ouida, The King of the Golden River by Ruskin, The Red Thread of Courage, The Elf and the Dormouse. Analysis of method. Chapter 4. How to tell the story. Essential nature of the story. Kind of appreciation necessary. Suggestions for gaining mastery of facts. Arrangement of children. The storyteller's mood. A few principles of method. Manner and voice from the psychological point of view. Chapter 5. Some specific schoolroom uses. Exercise in retelling. Illustrations cut out by the children as seat work. Dramatic games. Influence of games on reading classes. Stories selected and adapted for telling, especially for kindergarten and class 1. Nursery rhymes. Five Little White Heads. Bird Thoughts. How We Came to Have Pink Roses. Raggy Lug. The Golden Cobwebs. Why the Morning Glory Climbs. The Story of Little Tavwots. The Pig Brother. The Cake. The Pied Piper of Hamlintown. Why the Evergreen Trees Keep Their Leaves in Winter. The Star Dollars. The Lion and the Gnat. Especially for classes 2 and 3. The Cat and the Parrot. The Rat Princess. The Frog and the Ox. The Fire Bringer. The Burning of the Rice Fields. The Story of Wiley. Little Daylight. The Sailor Man. The Story of Jairus' Daughter. Especially for classes 4 and 5. Arthur and the Sword. Tarpeia. The Buckwheat. The Judgment of Midas. Why the Sea is Salt. Billy Beg and His Bull. The Little Hero of Harlem. The Last Lesson. The Story of Christmas. The Child Mind and How to Satisfy It. A short list of books in which the storyteller will find stories not too far from the form in which they are needed. Introduction. Not long ago, I chanced to open a magazine at a story of Italian life which dealt with a curious popular custom. It told of the love of the people for the performances of a strangely clad, periodically appearing old man who was a professional storyteller. This old man repeated whole cycles of myth and serials of popular history, holding his audience chamber in whatever corner of the open court or square he happened upon, and always surrounded by an eager crowd of listeners. So great was the respect in which the storyteller was held that any interruption was likely to be resented with violence. As I read of the absorbed silence and the changing expressions of the crowd about the old man, I was suddenly reminded of a company of people I had recently seen. They were gathered in one of the parlors of a women's college, and their serious young faces had, habitually, none of the childlike responsiveness of the Italian populace. They were suggested rather of a daily experience which precluded overmuch surprise or curiosity about anything. In the midst of the group stood a frail-looking woman with bright eyes. She was telling a story, a children's story, about a good and a bad little mouse. She had been asked to do that thing for a purpose, and she did it, therefore. But it was easy to see from the expressions of the listeners how trivial a thing it seemed to them. That was at first, but presently the room grew quieter, and yet quieter. The faces relaxed into amused smiles, sobered in unconscious sympathy, finally broke in ripples of mirth. The storyteller had come to her own. The memory of the college girls listening to the mouse story brought other memories with it. Many a swift composite view of faces passed before my mental vision. Faces with the child's look on them, yet not the faces of children. And of the occasions to which the faces belonged, those were most vivid which were earliest in my experience. For it was those early experiences which first made me realize the modern possibilities of the old art of telling stories. It had become a part of my work some years ago to give English lectures on German literature. Many of the members of my class were unable to read in the original the works with which I dealt, and as these were modern works, it was rarely possible to obtain translations. For this reason, I gradually formed the habit of telling the story of the drama or novel in question before passing to a detailed consideration of it. I enjoyed this part of the lesson exceedingly, but it was some time before I realized how much the larger part of the lesson it had become to the class. They used, and they were mature women, to wait for the story as if it were a sugar plum and they children, and to grieve openly if it were omitted. Substitution of reading from a translation was greeted with precisely the same abatement of eagerness that a child shows when he has asked you to tell a story and you offer instead to read one from the pretty book. And so general and constant were the tokens of enjoyment that there could ultimately be no doubt of the power which the mere storytelling exerted. The attitude of the grown-up listeners did but illustrate the general difference between the effect of telling a story and of reading one. Everyone who knows children well has felt the difference. With few exceptions, children listen twice as eagerly to a story told as to one read, and even a recitation or a so-called reading has not the charm for them that the person wields who can tell a story. And there are sound reasons for their preference. The great difference, including lesser ones, between telling and reading is that the teller is free, the reader is bound. The book in hand, or the wording of it in mind, binds the reader. The storyteller is bound by nothing. He stands or sits, free to watch his audience, free to follow or lead every changing mood, free to use body, eyes, voice as aids in expression. Even his mind is unbound because he lets the story come in the words of the moment, being so full of what he has to say. For this reason, a story told is more spontaneous than one read, however well read, and consequently the connection with the audience is closer, more electric than is possible when the book or its wording intervenes. Beyond this advantage is the added charm of the personal element in storytelling. When you make a story your own and tell it, the listener gets the story plus your own appreciation of it. It comes to him filtered through your own enjoyment. That is what makes the funny story thrice funnier on the lips of a jolly raconteur than in the pages of a memoir. It is the filter of personality. Everybody has something of the curiosity of the primitive man concerning his neighbor. What another has in his own person felt and done has an especial hold on each one of us. The most cultured of audiences will listen to the personal reminiscences of an explorer with a different tingle of interest from that which it feels for a scientific lecture on the results of the exploration. The longing for the personal in experience is a very human longing, and this instinct or longing is especially strong in children. It finds expression in their delight in tales of what father or mother did when they were little, of what happened to grandmother when she went on a journey, and so on. But it also extends to stories which are not in themselves personal, which take their personal savor merely from the fact that they flow from the lips in spontaneous homely phrases with an appreciative gusto which suggests participation. The greater ease in holding the attention of children is, for teachers, a sufficient practical reason for telling stories rather than reading them. It is incomparably easier to make the necessary exertion of magnetism, or whatever it may be called, when nothing else distracts the attention. One's eyes meet the children's gaze naturally and constantly. One's expression responds to and initiates theirs without effort. The connection is immediate. For the ease of the teacher, then, no less than for the joy of the children, may the art of storytelling be urged as preeminent over the art of reading. It is a very old, a very beautiful art. Merely to think of it carries one's imaginary vision to scenes of glorious and touching antiquity, the tellers of the stories of which Homer's Iliad was compounded, the transmitters of the legend and history which make up the Gesta Romanorum, the traveling raconteurs whose brief heroic tales are woven into our own national epic, the grannies of age-old tradition, whose stories are parts of Celtic folklore, of Germanic myth, of Asiatic wonder tales. These are but younger brothers and sisters to the generations of storytellers whose inventions are but vaguely outlined in resultant forms of ancient literatures and the names of whose tribes are no longer even guessed. There was a time when storytelling was the chiefest of the arts of entertainment. Kings and warriors could ask for nothing better. Serfs and children were satisfied with nothing less. In all times there have been occasional revivals of this pastime, and in no time has the art died out in the simple human realms of which mothers are queens. But perhaps never, since the really old days, has storytelling so nearly reached a recognized level of dignity as a legitimate and general art of entertainment as now. Its present popularity seems in a way to be an outgrowth of the recognition of its educational value, which was given impetus by the German pedagogues of Froebel's school. That recognition has, at all events, been a noticeable factor in the educational conferences of late. The function of the story is no longer considered solely in the light of its place in the kindergarten. It is being sought in the first, the second, and indeed in every standard where the children are still children. Sometimes the demand for stories is made solely in the interests of literary culture, sometimes in far ampler and vaguer relations, ranging from inculcation of scientific fact to admonition of moral theory. But whatever the reason given, the conclusion is the same. Tell the children stories. The average teacher has yielded to the pressure, at least in theory. Cheerfully, as she has already accepted so many modifications of old methods by new thought, she accepts the idea of instilling mental and moral desiderata into the receptive pupil via the charming tale. But confronted with the concrete problem of what desideratum, by which tale, and how, the average teacher sometimes finds her cheerfulness displaced by a sense of inadequacy to the situation. People who have always told stories to children, who do not know when they began or how they do it, whose heads are stocked with the accretions of years of fairyland dwelling and nonsense sharing, these cannot understand the perplexity of one to whom the gift and the opportunity have not come natural. but there are many who can understand it personally and all too well. To these, the teachers who have not a knack for storytelling, who feel as shy as their own youngest scholar at the thought of it, who do not know where the good stories are, or which ones are easy to tell, it is my earnest hope that the following pages will bring something definite and practical in the way of suggestion and reference. End Introduction. Recording by Sean McGahey, ducttapeguy.net.